Shalom, I'm Rabbi Stanley of Beta Venu and Torah Life Ministries. Today I'd like to tell you a story. Jews are storytellers, and this one's a doozy. This story starts out in the Appalachians. The Appalachian Mountains run from clear up in New York all the way down to Mississippi. But the area we'll be talking about is on the border of Kentucky and West Virginia. It's a very beautiful area. It's full of rivers and waterfalls, mountains, trees, and wildlife. It's also known for its coal deposits, which was very vital to many industries back in the 1800s. The area of the Appalachians we'll be talking about today is along the Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River, back in the year of 1863. And this story starts with a man. They used to call him Old Randall. Well, he doesn't look Jewish at all. Well, that's because he wasn't. In fact, he hated Jews. If he had his way, every Jew would be dead. He said we were all devils. He was really a mean old cuss. He was staunchly pro-Confederate. Randolph himself served in the 45th Virginia Infantry Battalion Confederate Army. That was during the opening years of the war, and was a POW of the Union from 1863 to 1865. But he later returned to his home in Kentucky. However, Randolph's younger brother, Asa, he had enlisted in the Union Army, in Company E of the 45th Kentucky Infantry Union Army. That was about 130 miles from where I was stationed in Fort Knox. Asa was discharged from the Union Army on December 24, 1864, after suffering a broken leg, and so he returned home. Well, needless to say, there wasn't a lot of peace in that family. One was Confederate, one was Union. Now, just because old Randall hated Jews, it doesn't mean there weren't a lot of us in the Appalachians. The Appalachians was full of Jews. There's a great book I read called Coalfield Jews in Appalachian History. Author and expert on Appalachian Jewry, who also wrote a book on the Jews of Baltimore, Deborah Weiner, she's the author of that book, states that 10% of the population in the Appalachians were Jewish. She writes, quote, "The fact might startle anyone familiar with Appalachian history that 10% of them were Jews, since very little has been written about the region to suggest that such a demographic makeup could have been possible. 10%. Think of it this way. Go into your hometown and imagine if 1 out of 10 people that you met was Jewish. Pretty amazing. Also, in Volume 2 of the Journal of the Southern Jewish Historical Society, a quote is given by one Louis Zaltzman. This is back in the 1800s, and he writes about a booming Appalachian town called Keystone in West Virginia. He wrote, quote, "The community there was small." This is in that town of Keystone. "It was small and rough, no electric lights or water supply, dirt and unpaved streets and roads, and very little law. Now, there was law on the outer parts. If you went further out into, maybe some bigger cities, but most of these towns didn't have any law." He says it was a frontier town with 14 saloons and about 15 Jewish families. That's a lot of Jews. That's just one little town. It was also home to the Bnei Israel, whose members built a strictly Orthodox synagogue, complete with a mikveh, balcony seating for the women, and there was no incompatibility between the raucous boomtown and the group of pious Jews. They could still function living in this town, live their lives set apart, and still be where they could deal with the local people. As Saltzman neglected to mention, many of the congregants made their living as saloon keepers. 5 of those 14 saloons were owned by Jews. There are a lot of resources concerning Jews in the Appalachians. Here's a list of just a few. You want to remember, back in the early days, Jews ran most of the liquor industry at that time. So you got to ask, where did all these Jews come from in the Appalachians? Well, the first big wave were German Jews. I'm not talking about the waves that came into America. I'm saying waves that went from while they were in America that went to the Appalachians. They were German Jews, but soon after came waves of Russian Jews. Yes, it's true that many stayed in New York and in the cities, but many who were fleeing persecution saw the countryside. They just come from countries where they had been persecuted. So they saw the countryside as a place where they could disappear and be safe from further persecution. But as we've already seen before, as we already know, anti-Semitism will find the Jew, and it will persecute the Jew, just like old Randall did. We'll get back to Randall shortly. This is, after all about him. So we came in these waves from Germany and Russia. Remember the quote I gave earlier from Louis Saltzman? He was actually a Russian immigrant. They came in the 1840s. Saltzman actually had a lot to say about the Jews in the Appalachians. He further wrote, quote, most of the Jewish families conducted businesses. The men coming there as pack peddlers shortly after their arrival from Europe, and who later opened up stores and became the leading merchants of the communities, end quote. I was thinking about this. It's just amazing we have any surviving writings from that area, from that time. It's amazing to me. So we came from Germany and Russia. Some even came from England. Now, I've talked about Jews from England before. And I'm going to use this little pointer, hopefully, if it works. And the Jews came from this area in England. So you see Nottingham there. We'll look at another map of this shortly. But back to old Randall. His family also had a good education. Now, I know it might be hard for some of us to think of Kentucky and the Appalachians as a place of educated people. We see old pictures like this. This picture here is in old Kentucky. Or like this, also taken in Kentucky. Or like this, and we think, well, they were all a bunch of hillbillies. Well, what do you think the houses looked like in the North back then? Not any different. Some of our people here, up in north in Washington State, there's a little town near us called Molson. And it's an entire ghost town that was kind of stuck back in the 1800s. And it doesn't look any different than any of the houses in the South did back then. It was the frontier. Kentucky and some of the other states around it were considered the frontier then. But that doesn't mean that those people were unsophisticated. Look at these pictures again, but look closely. Look how they dress. The men are wearing suits. One of them is holding a violin. For that day and age, that was cultured. The women are also dressed well for that time. Look at the white dress she's wearing. Yeah, years later, Kentucky did change. It changed after all the Jews left. They left and went to California in the gold rush. But before that, we had many in the Appalachians during the coal rush, C-O-A-L, coal rush. There's a particular kind of coal in the Appalachians of that area, anthracite. It's in other places too, but there was a lot in this area. It's a hard coal, good for industries. And Jews were there in these coal mining towns as businessmen. Jews that owned land that had a lot of this anthracite became wealthy. Land became very important then. Old Randall, he had a good amount of land himself, around 300 acres, but he didn't always have that. He grew up with nothing. His dad was said to be very lazy, and Randall's mother, Margaret, had to struggle to care for and feed and clothe the family. The whole family didn't treat their women well, and old Randall was no different. He married his first cousin because his uncle had a lot of money, and that's how he acquired some land. Her name was Sarah. That's a picture of her here. Together they had 17 children. 17. Out of those 17 children, 5 of them died due to violence. Their boys were out of control and they had that mean streak, just like their father. And they decided to take it out on the Jews. Well, which Jews would those be? He took it out on this man and his family. His name was William Hatfield. Old Randall's last name was McCoy. These were the Hatfields and the McCoys. Old Randall called William the devil, and this anti-Semitic slander stuck. But William looks like a rabbi here, doesn't he? Now, I'm not saying William was perfect, and I'm sure he made some mistakes. But you have to understand this feud if you want to understand this feud. You have to understand where they were living. There was no law in that area. There was further out. You had to go further out to get to any law enforcement. But in that area, there was no law. And the families had to handle things themselves. And I know that the media acts like no one really knows who started this feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. And if you look at most media, they side with the McCoys. And it's a big mystery, they say, who actually started it. Some say it was started over a pig, which it wasn't. That's just fable. The Hatfields had no use for a pig. And they act like it's some big mystery. But I can tell you who started it. And I'll tell you not from the Hatfields' perspective, but from the McCoys' side. See, I have a very rare copy of a speech. And this speech was written in 1902 by the McCoys' pastor, Robert Tyree. Now, in this letter, he defends the McCoys. They're his flock. But in this letter where he defends them, in doing so, he reveals how it all started. He writes, quote, an election was being held in Pike County, in which a voting precinct was located in the McCoy community. Elias and Ellison Hatfield came over from Mingo County and attended the election, which, as was always the case in the mountains, that it had more social than political significance. He says Tolbert, Fammer, and little Randall McCoy, these were all McCoys, they were there. Tolbert was grown, while Fammer was yet in his teens, and little Randall was only a child. Without going into the preliminaries which led up to it, a fight was staged, or competition, between Tolbert McCoy and Elias Hatfield. So they're going to have a boxing match. The fighting was with bare fists, and Tolbert was victorious. He goes on. After he had whipped Elias, Ellison challenged Tolbert, who, though wearied somewhat by his fight with Elias, accepted the challenge, and the fight began. This too with bare hands. Ellison was getting the better of Tolbert, which so affected Fammer, his brother, that Fammer rushed in and stabbed Ellison several times in the back. A rude litter was prepared, that's like a stretcher, and Ellison was carried by the Hatfields and their sympathizers across Tug Fork to the home of a friend. He continues. Elias Hatfield and his friends took charge of Tolbert, so they kind of like arrested him. Also Fammer and little Randall. Later, the three McCoys were taken over into West Virginia and confined under guard in a schoolhouse on Mate Creek. Word came to Sarah McCoy that her boys were held prisoners in the schoolhouse. She left her home and hurried to the place of their detention. The guards permitted her to see her sons, but would not release them. They were thus held for 3 days, at the end of which time came word that Ellison Hatfield had died from his wounds. Early the next morning, the Hatfields took the boys back across Tug Fork into Pike County, tied them to the trees. It was actually 2 of them, not 3 of them. There's a typo in here. Tied the 2 older ones to the trees and shot them to death. And he says this, thus the feud was launched in all of its fury. He goes, this is the last part. He says, many homes were to be destroyed and many lives lost before peace again came to these mountains. Thus came the second great sorrow in the life of Sarah McCoy. End quote. Now, this speech was written at Sarah McCoy's funeral. The pastor was a friend of the McCoys. They were his people, his flock. But we can clearly see here how this feud was started. They had a boxing competition. They didn't wear gloves up in the mountains. They went bare knuckle. The Hatfields lost the first fight, and all was well. But they were winning the second fight when all of a sudden, Fammer McCoy jumps into it, stabs the Hatfield guy 4 times. And then the guy dies. He was murdered. Now, there's a lot of other stories out there, but they are from accounts long after the feud started, or it's just from one side or the other. I'm giving you the account of the other, and it clearly says how the whole thing started. It doesn't make them look good. The guy's trying to defend them, but it actually reveals what happened. So the accounts that are much later, I didn't give them as much credit because I approached this pretty much the same way I approach biblical history. I go with the older accounts first. And here I also went with the other side's account. This is from their side. He writes even that this was narrated to him by Jim McCoy. So that was old Randall's son and a survivor of the feud. Jim McCoy was one of the survivors. So the McCoys murdered one of the Hatfield boys. And the Hatfields basically say, well, we're taking two of yours. We see parallels with the IDF today. You know, you murder one Israeli, and we're going to bomb 10 of yours, or what have you. So I kind of understand. You know, at first it sounds like, well, why'd they kill two and they only killed one? Because they started it. After the Hatfields got their justice, the McCoys wouldn't quit. And then they got one of the Hatfield, one of their relatives who was connected politically, and had some of the Hatfields imprisoned and had one of them hanged. This is a picture of old Randall with his family at the hanging of one of the Hatfield boys. They were a sick group of people. The McCoys also tried to steal land from the Hatfields. They tried to steal 5,000 acres from them. But fortunately, that was taken to a state court, and the Hatfields won the legal battle. The McCoys hated Jews, and not just the Hatfields. Have you heard the story of the McCoys and the Blumfields? The Blumfields were another Jewish family that the McCoys hated. November 1889, the Detroit Free Press picked up reports out of Milton, West Virginia, of, quote, another bloody battle involving the McCoys. In the account, the McCoys, quote, crawled up through the dense underbrush and poured in a volley on their sleeping foes, wounding a dozen men and killing two, including John Blumfield, one of the Klan's leaders. They were just murderous. The Hatfields, however, are the ones that are pointed out as the ones to blame by the world. But those who weren't anti-Semitic knew them, as one observer wrote in 1887, quote, they are a high-spirited family, but they are kind, neighborly, and just to all who treat them just. It's a different story than what we've heard about the Hatfields. It should also be noted that William Hatfield, the leader of the Hatfield family, was never imprisoned and wasn't even ever arrested. So to answer another point brought up earlier, where did they come from? They were Jews who came from Hatfield, England. Remember, we talked about waves of immigrants that came to the Appalachians. You know, first the Germans, then the Russians came, and then also some from England. Well, the Hatfields came from England. Here's where Hatfield is. You see the red dot there? I'll go ahead and use my pointer. Right here. And you'll notice you have Hatfield here, Nottingham here, Chesterfield over here, which was named after my family, and over here you have Lincoln. This was the area of Jews in England. Now, I'm not saying they weren't anywhere else in England. They were all throughout England in different places, but they were centrally located right in that area. So the red dot is where Hatfield is. And I've talked in other teachings about that part of England. Lincoln, Nottingham, and Chesterfield. That's the Jewish area of England back then. Hatfield is once again becoming a Jewish center in England. They had a big write-up about it in the Jewish Chronicle. You see the headline here, it says Hatfield. Is this the next big Jewish area? One may also wonder, how did I come across this information? I did a teaching earlier, and you can reference that on our yeshiva, about Jesse James, and then I did this one. Well, I wasn't even looking for this information. I just came across it. I was watching a Western movie, and Jesse James' mother's name popped up. Her name was Zerelda. I thought, well, that's an interesting name, and I looked it up, and then that started the next teaching on Jesse James. And as I was researching that, I came across a connection between the James family and the Hatfields. I thought this picture here of Jesse James kind of reminds me of the actor Ben Cross, who was also Jewish. They look very similar to me. The connection with Jesse and the Hatfields has to do when Jesse James was trying to stay away from the Pinkertons. He'd go see members of his family who lived in the Bernheim Forest. This forest was owned by Yitzhak Bernheim. I did a teaching a long time ago on Dreyfus. It's in the Modern Zionism series. We even watched a video with Richard Dreyfus. Dreyfus is actually a descendant of Dreyfus. It's about a Jew who had been wrongly convicted of a crime way back in 1948, before 48. It's about a Jew who had been wrongly convicted, and this case almost tore France in half. It's a great movie if you get to watch it. Well, anyways, they have a genealogy website on this by the Dreyfus brothers, and it gives the background for the name Bernheim. It says Bernheim, a common Alsatian name among Ashkenazi Jews, is associated with the village of Bernheim in Bavaria, in South Germany. The Jewish surname has been associated with the location of the Bergenheim, and I can't even pronounce that word, Mainberheim, in France and Germany. One of the earliest appearances, Bernheim was recorded as a Jewish surname in Bienville, France in 1724. Back then, in the Appalachians there, the whole area was Jewish. And that forest was named after the Jewish family who settled there. So as you know, Jews tend to stick together, and many of them knew each other. Well, William Hatfield knew the James family, and he bought a farm in Bernheim Forest. Jesse and William's son were friends, and they used to hunt together there when they were kids. They were both wealthy families, so they had that in common with each other. So that's the main connection between the Hatfields and the James family. So be careful what you believe from the mainstream media and Hollywood. They're not truthful. I hope you enjoyed the teaching.